Hello, this is Steve Sokol, the President of the American Council on Germany. Thank you for joining us today. It has been more than 3 months since the first lockdown measures were introduced in the United States, and many states and communities are now in the process of reopening. Precautions, such as sheltering in place, maintaining social distance of 6 feet, and the use of face masks have helped flatten the curve, but the coronavirus is still spreading at home and abroad. Although the situation seems to be better than it was a few weeks ago, there are increased cases in some states, as well as growing concerns about a second or even a third wave of COVID-19. The virus will continue to spread until a vaccine has been developed and is available to large swaths of the population. Joining us today is Dr. Kathrin Jansen. She is Senior Vice President and Head of Vaccine Research and Development at Pfizer. Dr. Jansen also serves as a member of Pfizer's Worldwide Research and Development Leadership Team. In her position, Dr. Jansen oversees a fully integrated global vaccines research and development organization with responsibilities ranging from discovery to registration and post-marketing commitments of first-in-class or best-in-class vaccines to prevent or treat diseases of significant unmet medical need. Kathrin Jansen, in light of the global pandemic, you are in great demand, and I want to thank you for leaving the laboratory today to talk with us.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's a pleasure to be on this call. So thank you for having me.
So before we dive into a conversation about the current crisis, can you talk to us a little bit about your career path and any observations that you have made regarding the opportunities for women who are passionate about science in both Germany and the United States?
Yes, so I actually got my degrees in Germany, in Marburg, where I studied microbiology. And then I went to the United States for my postdoctoral training, and I went to Cornell University, where I also met my husband, an American. And at that time, I was actually very eager. I wanted to go back to Europe, and I took a position in Geneva. And after a few years working in Geneva and living in Europe again, for professional reasons, my husband and I decided to go back to the United States, in part because for two professionals, both in the life sciences, the opportunities to both work in what we trained to do at that time were far better in the United States. There were just more opportunities. And so going back, I joined Merck Research Laboratories at the time, where I was actually hired into the vaccine arena, but for a program that had nothing to do with vaccines. Because at that time, that was in '92, there was a lot of discussions of should a large pharmaceutical company stay in the vaccine R&D space. And so it was about this kind of very uncertain time that I was hired at Merck, only to start on the program, reject the program. Essentially, we were unable to reproduce the data. And it was about the time, shortly after a discovery was made by a Australian group, that human papillomavirus, you could actually make recombinant virus-like particles. And so we picked up on this, and I started working on HPV with my colleagues at Merck, and we developed, as many of you may know, the cervical cancer vaccine, Gardasil. And so after that, I went to a small biotech company for a couple of years, only then to come back to large pharma, essentially for reasons of the opportunities to just do more. I think with my my involvement in Gardasil and having seen firsthand what a vaccine can do. As I always said, I got hooked into the vaccine arena. And so, then I went to WISE. We were working on a pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, Prevnar 13, that is now used pretty much all over the world to prevent pneumococcal disease in infants as well as adults. We worked on a bacterial vaccine that prevents meningitis B and got that licensed, and then built over the years, and then of course WISE was acquired by Pfizer, built over the years a really rich, what I would call vaccines portfolio. And so, yeah, that's what I have been up to. And, now, of course, with the beginning of the year, we got faced with this devastating pandemic. We made a decision that, with our experience, we needed to be part of this and make sure that we play our role in the race to develop a vaccine to prevent COVID-19.
Well, Kathrin, with one foot firmly planted in Europe and one foot firmly planted in the United States, and your background in vaccine research and development, you are in high demand at the moment, given what's going on, given the pandemic and the race that you talked about. And so I'd like to ask you, drawing on the experiences that you've acquired over the last 25 years or so, working on the development of various vaccines, what's different about working on the COVID-19 vaccine?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And actually, I would say everything is different. Nothing is as we ever experienced it. That starts with the time pressure, given that we are not working on a pandemic to be, but we are working on a pandemic that we are facing since the beginning of the year. So from a timing perspective, really all bets are off. Everything that we experienced before, every approach that we are taking is now very, very different. And I can give you a couple of examples. So maybe I should first start how we actually got into this. We were very, very fortunate that we are working with a biotech company in Germany, BioNTech, and had an agreement with them on developing a seasonal influenza vaccine using their mRNA platform. And we started working together for about 2 years, very, very constructively, on this platform, when we were faced with the pandemic. And BioNTech approached us and said, would you be interested to participate in developing COVID-19? We have some approaches ready to go. And I said, needless to say, of course, we have to do this. And it has been just an incredible different approach. So from the standpoint of having a very scientifically oriented partner that already had evolved the platform to work on a COVID-19 vaccine, to the internal support that we got from our company and the management to say, we have to do this no matter what it takes. So it was almost like a perfect marriage, right? You had the partner that brought the vaccine platforms. We had good relationships working together as partners, and then the Pfizer organization as a large organization to really pull out all the stops and say, whatever you need. I don't think in my over 25 some years that I'm in vaccine R&D, I've ever heard the head of the company that I worked for to said, whatever it takes, Kathrin, you just go and do it, with your team. So it actually, then lots of things can happen. All of a sudden, you know, whether it's financial hurdles or, you know, sometimes bureaucracy that you find in very large organization, all of a sudden, all this melted away. And it was only about how fast can you progress this vaccine. And so in order to do this, as you know, vaccine development is a very deliberate process, right? You spend years in research. You then, when you have a candidate, you say, okay, now this candidate is ready to go in clinical evaluation. And then you have all the phases of clinical evaluation that are sequential. And once you have clinical data, you make a decision, if they look good, to talk to your colleagues in the manufacturing arena and said, okay, I think we're onto something here. Maybe you now have to think about how you will make this ultimately once it becomes a product. So we are talking years already have gone by, and only then do we create the capabilities of making a vaccine. We still don't know whether it's working, but it's years down the line. In this particular case, everything happened at the same time. The R&D, we didn't know what the candidate are. We started with 4 different candidates because we said we can't make that decision. We don't have time. So may as well take the candidates all on the same similar mRNA platforms and evaluate in the clinic of which of the platforms gives us the desired responses. So that already shortened the time. At the same time, we engaged our whole manufacturing infrastructure and said, you know, the processes need to be further developed. They need to be finalized. They need to be scaled up. And by the way, we need millions and millions and millions of doses, not 5 years from now, but we need it this year. And what can you do about it? And so the other piece that we said we needed to do, we cannot have sequential kind of clinical development. You know, you have a phase 1, you look at the data, you pause, you then go to phase 2. So we came up with a very different plan of having what I call a seamless clinical development plan. You start evaluation in the clinic and you do not stop until you have reached the goal. You either demonstrate that you have a vaccine that works or you demonstrate you have a vaccine that doesn't work. That is a very unusual approach. And the way I always like to describe it is that we start with 4 different candidates. What we need to do is set up the study in a way that we can get what I call quick kills. So we need to narrow down very, very quickly into the one candidate that gives us the best chances of success. So we tag team with our partners in Germany to really weed things out as fast as we possibly could. But the rest of the infrastructure, like even getting ready for any of those 4 candidates, because, you know, we are still in the weeding process, they needed to be ready and think about how can we set ourselves up that no matter what the candidate is that we want to go forward with, we are ready to have clinical trial supply for large efficacy portion, the large efficacy portion of the study, and we need what we call pandemic supply. So this is tens of millions of doses by the end of this year, and hundreds of millions of doses, depending on, you know, what dose level the vaccine is most, I mean, induces the best immune response. This has never been done before. And it's very energizing because it's going very quickly. Yet we're doing the same work, just in a much more contracted, under much more contracted timelines, and doing many things in parallel that under normal vaccine development, it would have taken us, you know, as I said, sequential years.
Thank you for explaining that. I think for those of us who are lay people like myself, I mean, what I have read is that it's extremely rare to develop a vaccine in less than 5 years. And that has a lot to do with the kind of sequencing that you're talking about. And thank you also for sharing with us your insights on the partnership with BioNTech, because it sounds as if that is potentially a game changer in trying to move forward very, very quickly. I guess one question I would have is, once a successful COVID-19 vaccine comes out of trials, what happens next, given the incredible demand to have large numbers of the vaccine available?
Yeah, so what comes next is then really make sure that sufficient vaccine doses are produced. In my mind, and again, those discussions are ongoing and final decisions haven't been made. But in my mind, because the supply will be limited, and let's understand, there are many companies now working on a COVID-19 vaccine, because we all realize, number one, we don't know whether our vaccine is working or any vaccine is working, right? So you want to have multiple shots on goal. And then, but what it's also important in this crisis, that is, I mean, we have really not seen this in recent history, the kind of devastation that COVID-19 causes. We need to be sure that ultimately we can protect the world. Mm-hmm. And so I think the first number of doses will be limited, again, having multiple manufacturers with vaccines coming forward. I think it adds up, so you can at least protect the most vulnerable, you know, the individuals on the front lines that are healthcare workers, emergency personnel, you name it, so that you can protect those that and other vulnerable population that are feeling the brunt of the disease firsthand. And then as more and more vaccine doses become available, then you can roll it out to the larger population. But think about this. I mean, the global supply, we have to produce billions of doses, you know, to get the whole world immunized. And that's a tall order for just a single entity. So, and that's actually the reason why we are working together. You know, we have initiatives where companies share experiences that are driven by, in this country, it's driven by NIH, where we have working groups to see how we can facilitate and further accelerate vaccine development, because we need many of the same tools, right? We need reference standards to measure our immune responses. We need models that help us to gauge whether a given vaccine candidate is actually doing what it's supposed to do. And so there's a lot of cooperation and goodwill across, you know, the various companies to work together to make sure that at the end, you know, we will be successful and have vaccines available that can deal with this terrible disease.
Well, and as you've said, I think the next hurdle is making, once the vaccine is available, the next hurdle is making it available to everybody. And I'd be interested both in your thoughts about how you and Pfizer are thinking about this, but also whether you have any concerns about making a vaccine available that has not been through the traditional vetting and testing process.
Yeah, let me start with the latter part of your question. And I understand there's a lot of concern on the outside where folks think, well, if everything is so accelerated, will it be still safe? And that's a question that we hear often, and it's actually something that we take very seriously. So while the whole process is accelerated because of the reasons that we just got creative. You know, if you have a huge issue on your hands, all of a sudden you question everything and how you do what you do. And part of what we were able to see is, well, actually, if resources all of a sudden are not the issue, you get sufficient funding. There's a lot of stuff that you can do much more efficiently and much faster. But coming back to safety, we will run the same large phase 3 studies that we always run. So it's like we just will do it faster. We will have more sites. We will have more resources to get it done, again, to compress the time. But, you know, it's very important for in vaccine development and people like myself and others that have been doing this for a long time. It's all about safety. If you would see anything that would give doubt, you would stop it right there. And so that's why we all agree we need to do those large-scale safety studies. I mean, we're talking right now, the phase C portion of the study could be between 20 to 30,000 people. Yeah. Imagine that, 20 to 30,000 people. The only difference is enrollment in the past, we may have done it over a year. Now we said, let's do it in 2 months and let's set it up that way.
So your example of the collaboration between BioNTech and Pfizer is, of course, a great example of international cooperation. But we've gotten a couple of questions from viewers about that. One of our viewers writes that he's a little bit concerned about each country in this competitive race guarding their process, their data, their results, and wants to know, wouldn't it make sense to treat global pandemics as an open source problem where all countries share their data and share their results?
Yeah, so in a way, this is actually happening because, I mean, one thing that, I don't know if the question was asked by a scientist that you know, reads the relevant literature or by a layperson, but it's actually happening because we share almost in real time the findings of our studies. So, you know, again, under normal circumstances, when we put together data to publish, it takes a long time. Now you see almost, you know, real-time data being published in top-tier journals. So it's coming out like, you know, almost every other day. There's another study, there's another model, there's with the various vaccines that are being developed. We hear about clinical data. So all of this is like, it's almost like real time. And the journals, the scientific journals, they play a big role in this too. You know, reviews do not take 6 months before you get a, you know, verdict back, your paper's accepted or not. It's very, very fast. And so in a way, it is real-time data sharing is occurring, maybe by a different mechanism than what the question was maybe asking, but I think by a very efficient mechanism, because what we always have to think about is we have to use the strengths of, for example, individual companies. The company I'm working for and others that have many, many years of vaccine R&D experience and also the track record, we have built over the years the infrastructure. We can do things very, very efficiently, particularly with there is, you know, funding that is supporting it. So while we share data, while we share news that are coming out in almost real time, I think all of the companies that are in this race together, they build on their internal strengths. And so, because otherwise, you know, you would slow things down. To give you an example, I have a good example of this morning. I was in a meeting with some of my colleagues and we debated, there were just 10 people on the call, and we debated of how to approach a problem. And so you had 10 people on the call, you have 10 different opinions. So, you know, it's like, but there were certain people that had more experiences and they had actually ways of doing it. And so very quickly, the conversation was going away from something where there lot of opinions versus, okay, here's a practical way of actually doing this and getting this done. And so that was the outcome. So, sometimes having too many cooks in the kitchen is slowing things down. And I think what you see right now is everyone is working towards their strengths, the strengths that they have, and you have real-time data sharing so that it's pretty clear of where the science is, what we know, what we don't know. We hear about protective immune responses. I mean, there are papers coming out every day, so that you can redirect if you're on the wrong track, or it's affirmative if you're on the right track. So it's very powerful. It's just information is so much faster available now than it was in the past. It's actually amazing.
I'd like to come back to COVID-19 in specifically in just a minute, but while we're talking about the big picture and about the vaccine landscape, I'd like to ask you to look forward a little bit. How do you see the global environment for vaccine development going forward after the pandemic is over? Do you think that there will be a continuation of the kind of collaboration that you're describing right now, the kind of investment that you're seeing right now? Or do you think that things will return to the way that they were before?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but I can give you my, maybe my hope that I have, because this is a great example of what can happen when one is not prepared. We have been talking about pandemics for a long time, and there are a number of initiatives that have started to get prepared for this. Yet when it hit, none of us were prepared. And so I think what this pandemic is teaching us, that this is not, and we had other pandemics in the past, but they were not, at least not in recent history, to the same devastation than what we see now. What this pandemic is teaching us, we have not been prepared, we need to be prepared. Everyone wants to see a vaccine, then well, maybe we have to find other ways to work on platforms, for example, where you can very quickly drop in no matter what comes next, right? And do this supported by funders and governments that really say, look, this is important for the health of our populace. So we need to just make more resources available to make sure that we are not getting hit so ill-prepared a second time. Because you can be slow once, but I think there is really no excuse if a second pandemic would hit or a different pandemic would hit, that we are so ill-prepared as we have been now. And I think that is true. That is true globally.
I think that the lack of preparedness is certainly something that there's been a lot of discussion about in the U.S., both from a policy standpoint as well as a healthcare standpoint. And I guess as a immediate follow-on to your comment just now, how concerned are you about a second or even a third wave of COVID-19 cases? Are we better prepared to deal with those? And who do you think will be most hard hit if there are further waves of cases?
Yeah, so I think we have learned a lot already in the last 5-6 months. So I think if a second wave hits, and I have no insight whether that occurs or not. I think it's a concern, it's a worry, and I think what we need to be prepared for, that it could happen. And I think the learnings from the last 6 months, we have a much better idea how to deal with this. I think just the sheer enormity of the issue, I think most folks underestimated of what happens. And so we now know how to protect ourselves better. We're probably in a better situation to have now more supply of protective gear, of tests. We didn't have any tests, right? Now we have the tests. So we know what works and what doesn't work. So I think from that perspective, we are better prepared than when it first hit us. We learned a lot, in particular the areas and the whether this is in the States, for example, New York, which was hit with just enormous force. There were a lot of learnings of how to deal with this, and European countries as well, and seeing all of this and sharing best practices, I think we are in a better shape to address it. And hopefully, if it happens again by that time, that we will have a vaccine or vaccines already rolling out so that we have more tools than what we had when it all started at our fingertips to deal with this much better.
Kathrin, what about anti-vaxxers? Are you concerned that some people might not take the vaccine even when it becomes available?
There are actually some surveys that are going around that have asked precisely that question, asking folks whether, if a vaccine would be available, whether they take it. Now, the good news is 50% of the folks that were asked said yes. And the bad news is that 50% of the folks said no. But that's actually no different than what we see with flu vaccination in certain populations, right? Seasonal flu. I mean, seasonal flu kills people every year to various extents. And yet only certain populations, less than 50%, choose to take a seasonal flu vaccine. So it's no different. Now, I think this is just a general population. And then you ask about the anti-vaccine folks. Yes, it's always a concern because they are on the internet. They put a lot of information out there that is inaccurate. And so, you know, folks that read about this and they may not have the scientific background, or they do not have the information of where to get what I call scientifically sound information, like from the CDC or other entities. They are vulnerable and look at this and may be dissuaded to get vaccinated. But I don't think that's the majority. I think this is still a relatively small portion of individuals. Most individuals, they are listening to, you know, healthcare providers, and they also have access to go to CDC websites, et cetera, and get all the information that they need that is not opinionated, but that's actually scientifically sound. And so they have the tools, and so I'm not too concerned about this in general. I think it's just part of you know, dealing with the situation where you have certain groups of individuals that have a different idea and different opinions about almost everything, and so it is just demonstration over and over again of the importance of vaccines. We have opportunities with vaccines to eradicate diseases. We saw that with smallpox. We saw that with polio. It's almost eradicated, I may say. We still struggle a little bit. And that is just what vaccines have done for the world and public health is just enormous. And those are the facts. Mm-hmm. And, you know, so that's really, you know, all I would say to that group.
Kathrin, you just mentioned the seasonal flu, and with the next flu season virtually around the corner, I would bet that a lot of people will get the flu vaccine as soon as it's available. Do you think that this will give people a false sense of security, thinking that it will protect them from COVID-19 as well?
You know, this is an interesting question. I mean, again, I don't know. I would think there is enough information out there right now that people realize, and enough publicity that everyone realizes that those are two very different viruses and they need different approaches. So influenza vaccines work against influenza. They do not work against SARS-CoV-2, the virus that is causing COVID-19. So I would think that most people are savvy enough to know that the flu vaccine is just for influenza. And there's also the healthcare providers and where you get the flu vaccinations. I mean, I'm sure that it's something that if people have questions about this, they can ask whoever is delivering the vaccines, and they have the accurate information and can help in further educating individuals.
I was speaking with a healthcare or the head of a different healthcare company recently with operations in Asia, in Europe, and in the United States. And he was telling me that COVID-19 manifests itself differently in different parts of the world, and that there wouldn't be sort of one vaccine that fits all manifestations of COVID-19. We have a viewer question asking, what if the virus mutates? And I guess in this regard, what are your thoughts on different strains of COVID-19 and how to handle that from a vaccine standpoint?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a very important question. And there's a lot of data that, again, it's real-time data, and we're learning every day. So the virus is an RNA virus, so it's prone to mutations. And we do see mutations in SARS-CoV-2. But what we haven't seen yet is mutations in what I call the business end of the virus, that the virus needs to enter a cell and infect a human cell. And that's what we call the spike protein. That's one of those proteins on the surface of the virus that the virus needs to enter a cell. So when you carefully look, this protein has to interact with a cellular receptor. And we do not see changes there because that would be, so it's a receptor-mediated uptake. So the virus, in order to survive, needs to still maintain that structure and that sequence to be able to infect a human cell. So, and if you think about it, if a virus mutation would occur in what I call the business end of the virus, that the virus needs to infect a cell, then by definition, it can't propagate. It can't get into the cell, it can't replicate, and it dies. So I guess we are carefully monitoring this just to make sure that, because as I always say, viruses are clever. They sometimes find ways to evade your immune system. They find ways to change and learn new tricks, so to speak. But I think that's something, again, where we get sequences from all over the world. It's monitored very carefully, and we can address it. But so far, we haven't seen viral strains that would escape the current vaccine mechanisms that we bring forward. And so, as I said, it's a very good question. It's carefully monitored. Mm-hmm. And right now, though, I don't see this as a major risk, at least not in the foreseeable future.
Kathrin, I'm not sure if this is a topic you'd want to talk about, but we've gotten a couple questions about the World Health Organization. One is whether you can comment on the role of the World Health Organization in vaccine development moving forward. Will there even be a role? But the other is there have been some changing policy positions by the WHO, but also by the Center for Disease Control here in the US, that possibly have caused people to reduce their trust and confidence in scientific and data-based evidence. Are you at all concerned that positions by organizations like the WHO and their flip-flopping, if you will, can undermine some of the scientific work that you're doing?
I don't see this as an issue. I think at the end we always say science will win, because science is something that is based on facts, not on fiction. And so ultimately, it doesn't matter what people say and what opinions are. At the end of the day, we find the right answers to our questions, and that's why science is so strong. And one should always ask if there are things discussed, are they based on scientific merit, or but are they based on opinions? And so that's number one. As for the WHO, I think it's a very important organization that is actually crucial in helping to make sure that vaccines, for example, come to the poorest countries in the world. They are instrumental in this. We are working actively with WHO for precisely that reason. I mean, they have created an infrastructure, working with funding agencies, working with vaccine manufacturers to make sure that the vaccines get to parts of the world as fast as possible to protect, even people living in the poorest countries of the world. So it's a very important organization. And they were instrumental in eradicating smallpox. WHO played a huge role in other infectious diseases to get them under control. So if we think about, which we all do, that's why we are working on vaccines, on global public health. They're a very, very important organization that actually helps to achieve as much parity as we can provide with vaccines as possible to ensure that children and adults living in some of the poorest countries of the world have access to life-saving vaccines.
Kathrin, this has been a fabulous discussion. I would love to ask you one more question if you have time for it, but I know that you need to head to the lab. Do you have another minute or two, or?
Well, I can give you another minute, but not much longer.
Not much longer? Then let me just ask you, I mean, I've been so appreciative of the very sort of direct and focused and optimistic and hopeful tone that you've taken throughout our conversation, despite the difficult challenges that we face on multiple fronts at the moment. And I guess in closing, I'd be curious to know what keeps you hopeful and optimistic in dealing with the current challenge that we face?
I think what keeps me hopeful and optimistic is that we have the tools to do something about the pandemic. Right, so at least we can. I'm hopeful from the data that are coming out already. I'm very hopeful that there will be a vaccine or several vaccines to stem the pandemic. And the faster we can get this done, the better for everyone. So that what gives me hope. That's what drives me. That's what energizes me. So hopefully that we can get back to where we came from, or maybe even get to a better place. We talked about being better prepared, right? So I think, if anything, this pandemic should taught us, all of us, that it's just a matter of time and we get hit again. And next time around, my hope is, and given what we are learning currently, is that we will be prepared and that it will not come to those devastating consequences, both from a health perspective, but also from an economic perspective.
Well, Kathrin Jansen, ein herzlichen Dank. A huge thanks to you and your colleagues at Pfizer for the very important work that you're doing. But thank you for really sharing these frank and open thoughts with us today. I'm deeply appreciative of it, as I know our viewers are as well. So thank you again, and thank you to our many viewers for your wonderful questions and for being involved in this discussion. And to everybody, stay well.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Take care. Thank you.